Our last presentation will be on cash flow models, evaluations versus valuations. This presentation was prepared by Ms. Amy E. Jacobson and Dr. Robert Cameron. Amy is going to be the presenter this morning. She is a senior associate and chair of the board of directors at Baird Dolbear with over 25 years of diverse experience, which has included cash flow modeling for project valuations and evaluation, and numerous other accolades. Dr. Robert Cameron is a senior associate of Baird Dolbear and has over 35 years of experience in geostatistical analysis or reserves, computerized mine planning, mine design, and computerized studies for mine production optimization. Amy?
Okay, so there is a general assumption out there that cash flows are one-size-fit tool, solution or tool to valuations and evaluations. So when is a cash flow is a cash flow, right? We find often that people believe that if they can run Excel, they can just generate a cash flow and place a value on a property or a project. Or they can just simply pull out an old company cash flow model and apply that to determining a fair market value for their project. But we know that that's not always the case, and especially not the case from valuation standpoints. On the surface, cash flows seem to be very simple. For those of us out there who are engineers, we all took that class out there that was the time value of money, where we learned simply that you can throw a bunch of engineering values into a cash flow model, generate an NPV, and that gives you all of your answers. But a cash flow model, although it is an extremely powerful tool, it is generally and greatly misused and misunderstood out there in the industry. So there are multiple uses for cash flow models, which of course leads to the concept of it being a very powerful tool. There are a lot of similarities, but in reality, there are fundamental differences between the different cash flow models that can be used, especially in their purpose and use, their inputs, their outputs. And really, if you generated different types of cash flow models for the same project, you could truly produce very greatly differing results. So it is critical for us to know the purpose of a particular cash flow model in evaluating and valuing a project. So when Bob and I sat down to do this presentation, we said, okay, what are the different types of cash flow models? So we came up with 3 general categories. And I'll admit that there's probably other categories here, but these are the ones where we were able to group most of the cash flow models that we've used. The first category is the technical cash flow model, and these are typically used in evaluating the economic viability of a project or the reserves. The second type of a cash flow model is the financing model. These models are used to look at the financing options and the profitability of a project or the reserves. And then finally, the valuation models, which many of us are familiar with, which are used to get to a fair market value. So remember when we were all growing up and you had those 2 pictures and you'd have the 2 pictures and you had to figure out the differences between them? And sometimes those differences were very subtle, and then sometimes they were very obvious, like a mustache on the kitty cat. Part of the reason I decided to use this picture, because I dare you during the rest of this meeting to find somebody who actually decided to use pictures of puppies and kitties in their presentation. And also, this is the reason why I did not go into a career of graphic art. So cash flow models, how do they relate to one another and how are they different? Well, in general, all 3 of these categories share the same basic technical inputs, but that's the point at which they start to diverge, and that's where the similarities end. So I need to quickly touch upon that center circle there, which is the basic inputs. These are inputs that are typically engineered. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because really you could fill a whole day just talking about the inputs that go into a cash flow model. And there are a number of references out there. But in general, the idea is determining and modeling what is there, what is in the ground. What are you going to do to get it out? How much are you going to produce? And how fast are you going to produce the product? How much cash is it going to generate? How much will it cost to build, and how much will it cost to close, and how much it's going to cost to produce that product. What I really want to focus on is the purposes and differences between these three different categories. So the first category is the technical cash flow model. This type of model tends to be a little bit more simplistic than the other two. The purpose really oftentimes is determining the economic viability of the reserves. But they can also be used to do the relative technical viability of different project options, as well as the requirements needed for securities filings, independent technical reports, the NI 43-101, preliminary economic assessments. They can also be used to determine the potential profitability, but this is typically done on an internal corporate basis for internal corporate decisions. And this is the place where you would look at a minimum profitability as defined by a board for the hurdle rate on investments. And then finally, in some cases, government permits need to show a project viability, and that's where this type of model would be used. In general, this type of model would most likely be generated and created by an engineer, someone who has a working knowledge of those basic technical inputs. So what are some of the characteristics of these types of models? Well, to begin with, oftentimes they're done on a 100% equity basis without any debt financing modeled into it. You're really looking at the technical aspects. You're not looking at true business decisions. The idea is that you're looking at economic viability, not necessarily profitability. They can be done on an either pre-tax or after-tax basis. Obviously, pre-tax is relatively simple, but what about after-tax? And in some cases, taxes can be a very complex question, especially in a multinational company that has a tax regime or corporate structure. In these cases, we would typically see that you would do a very simplistic tax consideration where you would just say this country has an income tax rate of this, and these are the depreciation and depletion rules. The question on these is oftentimes the discount rate, and we felt that the discount rate for these would be not something complex like a building up for first principles, but you would look at something like the Prudent Man rule, weighted average cost of capital, or a minimum acceptable rate of return as set by a company's requirements and goals. The outcome is often a decision that would be based on the resulting NPV or IRR. So I want to circle back to the discount rate and the concept of a Prudent Man rule. What this rule says is that a prudent investor would not lose money, but they would get their investment back at a minimum, thus helping to define what a economically viable project. And in this case, it would be possible to use a 0% discount rate. And oftentimes when you say that, you can hear the sharp intake of breath from many people who say, oh no, you cannot use a 0% discount rate. And it's a difficult concept to accept, but because we've conditioned that you have to have a discount rate that has a value. But 0 is a value. And so the idea here is that you're really just looking at what would happen if you change the different technical inputs into the cash flow model, and would an investor actually get their investment back. So the second type of model is the financing cash flow model. These are typically used by brokers and financing specialists. The idea here is to allow a financing institution to look at exploring leverage scenarios or the company to compare maybe financing imposed requirements such as reserve tails or debt service coverage ratios. Also to compare various debt instruments, hedging options, and then also to look at the financing involved with potential IPOs, mergers, and acquisitions. So, what makes them different than the technical cash flow model is the fact that the debt and equity financing components are incorporated into the models. And they tend to be far more complex and detailed than a standard technical cash flow model. They can be done either on a pre-tax or an after-tax basis. Pre-tax is not uncommon for banks who are just looking solely at the loan ratios. And as I mentioned earlier, the after-tax piece on these could be quite complex, especially if you have a company that has a complicated tax regime or corporate structure. And these models would actually incorporate that type of tax consideration just versus the simple Mexico has a tax rate of X. These models are more likely to be developed by an accountant type versus the engineer type. So the basic inputs in these models, obviously the basic technical inputs, but a variety of all the different financial inputs. A higher level of engineering is usually required for these cash flows. They're looking for a much more reliable model with less margin of error. So these models would not be developed for something like a scoping study project, but something that's more on the feasibility level. The discount rate for these usually relates to the cost of debt. And the outcome is not necessarily measured by NPV, but it's really these other ratios, the debt service coverage ratio, payback period, and debt and equity ratio, as well as many others. So finally, the third category is the valuation cash flow model. Obviously, this model is used to determine the fair market value of a property, project, reserves. And it's one part of the equation for determining value. Obviously, it would be combined with other methodologies to come up with the fair market value. The use of cash flow models in the income approach is appropriate for later stage projects with some of the engineering completed. It would not be used in most cases for exploration projects which have not had much engineering input to them yet. The basic inputs, obviously all the previously stated inputs. The level of engineering for these is typically quite variable. It can range, and it's really dependent on the development status of the project. They can be done either on a 100% equity basis or with some limited financing components. They're typically after tax. And the discount rate, this is where the discount rate becomes quite important. You would see weighted average cost of capital, as well as discounts that are built up from first principles, as well as industry practice. For example, if there's just a standard industry practice of using a 10% discount rate, that might be appropriate in certain cases. The outcome is obviously the NPV, which produces the project or company's fair market value, and in combination with other valuation methods. So Bob and I stopped and decided to look at a couple of case studies. And we at Barry LaBear, we deal with a variety, oops, did I go? We deal with a variety of evaluations for independent technical reviews that are used on stock exchanges. These are typically done as a review of a project or a company's cash flow. And really, the general purpose of these is the economic viability of the project and the reserves. As I stated earlier, we have used a 0% discount rate on some of these, or the industry standard, or oftentimes a client preferred value. The key to this is that we are not doing a valuation, nor are we looking at the profitability of the project. That's a business decision. This is whether or not the project can stand on its own based on the technical inputs. If you're looking at profitability, that is implied to tie to business decisions, and that's generally outside the limits of a typical independent technical review. What we're really looking at is cash in and cash out as driven by the technical inputs. So what are some of the typical difficulties that we've encountered of this? Well, the first one is that there is a widespread misconception that NPV, any NPV, is the value. We see this very often. And sometimes we run into issues about reporting the NPV. Many times the brokers don't want to, for you to report a value because they want to use their own value as part of the overall listing document. What we have found is that it is critical in these reports that we indicate that the reported NPV does not indicate the value of a project, and that the sole purpose of this analysis is the economic viability of the reserves. So our second case that we wanted to bring up was a litigation support project that we recently have been working on. It is not atypical that multiple cash flows may be developed and used in these kinds of cases. This was a case assessing damages caused by significant project delays. So in this particular project, there was a simple technical cash flow model that was developed. The idea was to demonstrate whether or not the project would have been economically viable had it gone forward. It truly was just built to look at what happens with the technical inputs, with the production, and the reserves. There was also a financing cash flow that had been developed by another party, and the purpose of it was to look at the profitability based on a particular set of options, and including the financing options. And then finally, there was a damage and valuation cash flow that was put together. The objective of that cash flow was to assess the damages caused by outside influences. It took into account not only the technical aspects of the project, but it really looked at the effect of the delays caused by outside influences on the project. So our observations in this particular type of use for cash flow models was that technical valuations tend to be ex ante. They are a point in time, oftentimes prior to the litigation or the event that has resulted in the litigation. The damage assessments tend to be ex post. They take into account the actual events since that event that has led to the litigation. In this case, the value of the damages was really related to the assessment of the potential delays in the construction of the project, not necessarily in the technical aspects of the project. In this case, there were several different types of delays. Some of them were caused by social and environmental issues. There were permitting delays, which resulted in delays from the need for public comment. And then there were actually a need for some additional final engineering and engineering studies. The key here is that a simple technical cash flow model can be insufficient for assessing these damages, and so that model went into far more detail than the technical model did. So damages are really related to the concept of profitability, which tends to end up being a blend of the three different types of cash flow models, including the project-specific financing options. But what the lesson learned out of this is that the courts and arbitration panels don't want three different NPVs. They don't want three discount rates. They want just one. So it gets down to the case of determining which of these cash flow models is most appropriate to present to the arbitration panels. So we're actually pretty short on the length of our talk also, so I'm going to get to the silver bullet to this, and that is that you don't want the perceived simplicity of a cash flow model or the fact that somebody can just generate one using Excel, or even the kind of the elegance involved with some of the more complex cash flow models to fool you. The key to the proper application of cash flow modeling is clearly understanding the purpose and the intent of that cash flow model to a situation to which it's being applied. The reality is that not all cash flow models are created equal, and their application and their purpose is critical. And with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. And because I had to stand up here and present, Bob's actually going to answer most of the questions. And non-Barry don't bury people, please.
Yeah, this is a very easy question. I'm John Head. You talk about only wanting one NPV. We only want one responder to questions.
Hi, Amy.
Hi.
Grant Malenzik. I'm part of Bill Brosco's group here.
Oh, great.
Do similar role. Your opinion, the reliability of an after-tax MPV, and especially the technical models. I hear often from old school engineers that engineers don't do taxes. Yet I find when I'm doing my models and the engineers are fighting pennies over $1 per ton, I'm sitting there going, there's 300, 400 basis points between pre-tax and after-tax. So I'd like to get your opinion on that.
I personally prefer to do after-tax models because, especially in foreign jurisdictions, the tax can be a significant cost to the project. I think the pre-tax in some ways is more applicable to comparing different project options. Let's say you have two flow sheets that you want to look at. Okay, the tax is the tax on that. It's going to be the same for both of them, so you really are just simplifying the analysis by using a pre-tax on that.